Hi everybody, I have Noel Elfant with me to talk about his experience in dealing with a cyber breach. So Noel, take it away.
Tony, thank you for having me. Glad to be here, everyone. Let me start by just giving you a little background on who I am. I grew up in Los Angeles and attended UCLA, but moved out to Chicago to attend law school at Northwestern. After graduating law school, I was a corporate and securities lawyer at McDermott, Will & Emery before moving in-house to a company then known as Fortune Brands. Fortune Brands was a large consumer products company. It owned Titleist and Jim Beam and ACCO and Swingline. And after 10 years working my way up in the legal department at Fortune Brands, I became general counsel of Zebra Technologies Corporation, which makes barcoding and RFID technologies. And there I was general counsel, corporate secretary, and a chief compliance officer for the publicly traded company. I was there for about 8 years, and for the last 8 years I've been at general counsel for DeLaval Inc., really for the North American operations of DeLaval. DeLaval is part of a very large, multi-billion-dollar Swedish company known as the DeLaval Group, which has a number of larger sister companies. But DeLaval is about $1 billion manufacturer and marketer of dairy farm equipment and cleaning chemicals for the food processing industry. So with that background, let me give you a little background on what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about, basically the practical requirements for responding to an actual cyber breach, which unfortunately occurred shortly after I became general counsel at DeLaval. At DeLaval, we have a retirement plan known as a 401k plan, whereby employees contribute a portion of their salary to a retirement fund for themselves, and DeLaval will match that amount of the contribution up to a specified amount. And that money is typically invested by a big plan administrator in mutual funds to help grow the funds for the employee's retirement fund. So imagine this. You're a DeLaval employee. You've been contributing a large portion of your, say, 3% of your salary to your 401k plan. The company has been matching that, and you have a lot of money built up in retirement fund. And so you call into your 401k plan to just kind of check the status of your funds, and you're denied access to your account. When you call the plan's phone number to find out what's going on, you find out your social security number is still associated with your account, but your account is now linked to somebody else's name, somebody else's address, somebody else's email address. Basically, your social security number has been hijacked by somebody you don't know. And to top it all off, $50,000 has been borrowed against your account. That's what we are faced with. That's what we learned about. And I'm going to go through the timeline and then the steps we had to take to not only discern the breadth of this cyber breach, but how to respond to it. So this is a timeline, and it's a little skewed because it's in chronological order. So, and I say that because the first item on here is this proof of concept breach that occurred on November 12th. But we did not know about that till we investigated the breach, and that investigation didn't occur till November 28th.
So you could say that you later proved that a breach occurred
That's
on November
right.
12th. Okay.
So we discovered also that on November 26th and 27th, major breaches occurred against the accounts of 5 of the employees. And 2 of them were actually, money was borrowed against their accounts. But that employee who was denied access to her account on the 27th, and the plan, the third-party plan, investigated that breach because internally our human resources professionals who monitor and administer the plan internally, they felt this might have been a breach not of DeLaval, but rather the third-party plan that invests the funds. And they called them and asked them to investigate. And what they discovered at that point in time is that a proof of concept breach actually occurred through a compromised laptop in the Human Resources Department on November 12th.
Right, so it was internal. It wasn't like Vanguard or Fidelity had been hacked.
Right. And so what we discovered happened is what's known as phishing. You may have heard of that in your class or heard of it in the press, but it's where a hacker will send an email or a link, and you click on this link that's really a false link, and it infiltrates your laptop and allows the hacker to get access to everything on that laptop, and sometimes everything within the network that the laptop is connected to. Well, in this person's laptop she was the internal plan administrator for DeLaval of our 401k plan, and the hacker was able to, we believe, through this phishing episode, gain her passwords and her access keys to the 401k plan. And once in the plan, this individual was able to get the social security numbers, the addresses, the emails, the employment status, likely the logon credentials of approximately 1,500 employees and retirees located in 35 states around the country. And started manipulating those accounts on November 26 and 27, including borrowing $49,870 from one and $32,000 from another, we think on the 27th of November. And the last item on this timeline is that the legal department was not notified about this by the HR department, which learned about it on the 27th, until December 5th. That's a lesson that we learned the hard way, because there are some state laws that we'll talk about later that require notice within a period of time that we already were late on by the time the legal department got notified of this breach. Now, the HR department thought, well, we're going to handle it with our plan administrator. They didn't realize there were notification requirements in many of the states. They didn't understand the requirements that we're faced with as a company when we're breached in this fashion. And so it took them a while before they felt maybe we should tell the legal department this.
Well, what I'm wondering is this was right around Thanksgiving. Maybe that was intentional timing.
By the hackers,
Yeah.
Perhaps. Yeah.
And then another idea I had, you talked about phishing attack. This reminds me of the cybersecurity concept of an insider threat, where an inside person causes the breach, even accidentally, clicking on that bad link.
Well, when we first discovered that it was breached through the HR department's laptop, we were thinking that this was an internal threat. But you'll see we did engage in a forensic, we'll get to this, one of the steps we took was a forensic review of the laptop. And it was discovered quite easily that it was a phishing email from a foreign source. And we also learned that it was very likely to have come from Eastern Europe.
I guess what I'm saying is an inside threat could be a bad employee or somebody who accidentally
clicked on a link that
Yeah.
they shouldn't have, which is what actually happened here.
Yeah.
So the good news is that the illegal borrowings were thwarted. There were 2 checks cut to bogus names. The third-party plan administrator, upon learning this, was able to stop one check before it was mailed. The other check was actually on a UPS truck headed to the destination and was intercepted. Now, so no money was lost from the 401k plan, and of course, at this moment in time, the plan was frozen, so no further changes could be made to any of the accounts. Now, interestingly, our first response was, well, if the check's en route to a bogus address, why don't we let it go and have the FBI track it and see who picks up the check? But the FBI, you'll see one of the steps we had to do was contact law enforcement. The FBI basically rejected that proposal on 3 grounds. One, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. You're able to stop the money from going anywhere. Let's not risk any chance of that money getting lost. We're able to stop the check from being cashed and pull it back. Count your blessings. End of story. 2, they believed even then, before this occurred, before we got the forensic evidence of this, they even at that point believed this probably was an attack from a foreign enterprise, and that there was no way we were going to catch anybody of value who would get that check from the bogus address. That it is likely that someone would respond to a Craigslist advertisement to just pick up the mail at one place and bring it to another place, and they have these sophisticated mechanisms for laundering the money in these things. So they felt that they would get only low value, almost inconsequential pieces of the puzzle if they were to do that. And 3, frankly, it wasn't worth the cost for them to have put a man on this and follow the trail like this. As it turns out, we were relatively small potatoes, and while they were involved mainly to keep them informed and for their own data collection.
Yeah, and as you know, it does take a ton of work to build a case against somebody and prove it and pursue those charges. So I think given all the info that the FBI gave you, it made sense not to go after it.
Yeah, I could tell you when another case I had as general counsel is embezzler, and there we knew the employee who embezzled money, and we wanted to prosecute him, and we still had to spend upwards of $500,000 in developing the evidence to wrap it in a bow and hand it to prosecutors before they were willing to arrest the individual, because they did not want to spend. It wasn't important to them. It wasn't one of the big fish that they were after. If we did all the legwork, they would prosecute, but they weren't going to go out and develop the evidence and prosecute the individual. Same thing here. The FBI wasn't going to spend the money to do this.
Yeah, I guess, and I wouldn't want to be cynical or jaded about it, right? Because your U.S. attorney and FBI, I mean, they have a lot of serious crime to deal with. And
That's exactly right.
If there's a kidnapping going on at the same place, they're going to focus on that. So
Exactly. So what did I have to do as general counsel to respond to this breach? Here's the background. You may have heard of GDPR in Europe now, where there's this unifying statute that governs cyber breaches, and it's complicated, but at least it's unifying and it applies to all EU countries. The U.S. is not part of that. Certainly back when I was, when this cyber breach happened a number of years ago, there was no GDPR in any event. But there's not even a U.S. law that applies to all entities. If you're in healthcare, if you're in financial services, there are federal laws that apply to you that give you some guidance. But as a manufacturer and marketer of dairy farm equipment or cleaning chemicals, there's really no unifying federal law that you could turn to. So instead, there's really a patchwork of statutes and regulations and guidelines that are applicable to various industries and actors. And that's what we had to deal with here. As I said, there were 1,500 plan participants affected in 35 different states. So you really have to understand what the federal law requires of you and what each of those state laws require of you. And the first thing you have to do is figure out what states your plan participants are in, and then figure out what those laws require of you. So we took 9 steps to respond to this, and these are not sequential. They're, in essence, you try to do them all at once, if you will. And so while ultimately no money was lost from our plan, there was a lot of money expended in lost time, in marshaling the resources of your company to respond to these things, in lost opportunities. You couldn't really focus on business during the week and a half or 2 weeks that you're concentrating on responding to this matter. But these are the 9 steps that I'll run through in the next several slides. Notify law enforcement and your insurance carrier. You always want to notify your insurance carrier immediately because certain of your policies may prevent you from recovering if you fail to notify the insurance carrier, because they need to make sure that you're responding to the incident in a manner that best protects them, their risk of loss. And so they want to see that you're contacting law enforcement and you're doing all the appropriate steps to make sure and mitigate any loss. We, of course, notified immediately the 5 employees whose actual accounts were manipulated, and certainly the 2 that were borrowed against. But we also had to prepare a list of everyone in the plan and where they lived and what states might have been implicated. We retained outside counsel, and that's a very important step. The laws in this area are constantly changing. You want a law firm kind of at the ready who understands these laws and are dealing in these areas all the time, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We, of course, once we realized where the breach happened, we secured the laptop and we retained a forensic expert to analyze the laptop to figure out how this happened. We drafted a script for the 401k because we knew employees were going to continue to check their 401k plan, as they always did. And once they discovered this breach occurred, they're of course going to be calling the number, and we needed a plan for the 401k to talk about it. And we drafted a holding statement and a Q&A statement, which I'll talk about a little later. We contracted with credit monitoring services to offer our employees, and we drafted and sent the appropriate notices to state attorneys general as required. So let's go through these. Tony, if you have any questions, by all means, bring them up.
Sure.
Okay, notified local and federal law enforcement and our insurance carriers. This breach occurred in Kansas City. That's where our HR department was located at the time, and that's where the laptop was. So we had an obligation to contact the Kansas City Police Department. I say obligation because our insurance carrier alone would have required us to notify local law enforcement. So we notified them immediately, and a cybercrime report was filed. We also notified the FBI, and they required us to keep them in the loop every step of the way. Any forensic reports they wanted to get, they wanted to know what we discovered, how we discovered it. They were not active in helping us, but they were active in the sense that they were interested in the steps we took and the outcomes. We had to notify states' attorneys general. In some states, not all states required that. And as I said, the insurance carriers. We immediately notified the employees whose accounts were manipulated, of course, and once we secured knowledge that their accounts were did not in fact lose money, we of course informed them of that, and we prepared a list of all our employees and retirees who were affected, because we believed that even though 5 accounts were manipulated, that the hacker potentially had access to all this information. So we felt we had to let our plan participants know that. We retained outside counsel. As I said, state laws are very similar on the subject, but differences do exist, and they're really a pain. Like if Vermont requires certain headings to be in their letter to affected employees in their state, but Indiana doesn't, then you can't use what you did in Indiana with Vermont. They want to see their template. They want to see their requirements. So sometimes it's very small differences, but it requires, of course, a separate letter for the employees or retirees in that state.
It would be just way too hard for you as one lawyer who doesn't do this all the time to manage all of the notification letters.
It would be. I mean, I could show you the 50-state survey that we ultimately used that came from a law firm that was already doing this stuff on a regular basis, because you don't want to pay them to reinvent the wheel and at that moment in time go and investigate the 50 states. You want a law firm that's already done this and keeps it updated on a regular basis, so that you're not paying for that survey the way you would if you had to get it done out of the wheel, out of the gate. I put on here a little picture of a cutout, if you will, from the homepage of one law firm, and they actually have a data breach hotline 24/7 button on their homepage, which I thought was pretty unique, because that basically tells the world who's at their homepage, hey, we are expert in this. You're not going to have to reinvent the wheel with us. We know how to respond, and we can do it quickly. And if you click on that button, you get a number to call, and they promise someone would be at the other end of that call to respond 24/7. It could be 3 a.m. you get a call like that.
I don't want that call.
No. But it shows the importance that this has become in today's business world. So we secured the laptop that was traced to the hack, and we retained a forensics expert. And the legal department typically retains that expert, not the HR department, because you want whatever's discovered to remain privileged and confidential until we decide that it's not. And so one of the things I had to do, as you would any significant contract, is negotiate that contract. And it included a detailed scope of work. We obviously wanted them to figure out what occurred, but we also wanted monthly vulnerability reports going forward. So as we responded to the attack in ways of imposing new security measures, for example, we wanted them to constantly be monitoring, at least for the next year, whether we were vulnerable, and if we were, what we could do to close up that vulnerability. So then we drafted a script because we knew employees were going to be calling their 401k plan. And what are they going to be hearing when they call? Because their plan was frozen until we could be confident that it was secure again. And so this is the script that we drafted, and it basically says DeLaval and the name of our third-party plan are working together with law enforcement authorities in an investigation of a possible breach by an unidentified hacker of DeLaval employee information contained in 401k retirement accounts held at the plan administrator. Here's what transpired in your account. And then we would want to be as specific as possible. So if it was one of the 5 that was actually manipulated, we actually had the person if they knew that's the person that called, they would look up that person's account, they'd see what happened to that account, and they'd be absolutely honest with them. Oh, your name and address were changed, your account was borrowed against or it wasn't borrowed against, here's what occurred, we froze your account, no money was lost. If it was one of the countless others, we just simply said, we are assuming that this data, the following data was made available to the hacker. We have no evidence that they've done anything with that information, so it could be that they didn't download that information. But we can't assume that at this point.
Right.
And for now, all the accounts are frozen. They'll be unfrozen when we're secure. And then we said, if you have any questions, contact, and I was the spokesperson for the internal employees who had questions.
That's so important to have a designated spokesperson.
Right, because otherwise, who do I call?
You have inconsistencies if you talk to anybody. And then also, what if the press reached out to your company? You'd want to dedicate a specific person to deal with the press.
Yeah, and fortunately, we never had the press call on this one, but we did have a plan for that. And in fact, we drafted a holding statement, which we typically would draft in a litigation context if we had a significant litigation and we were getting questions. So it's slightly different from what the plan said, but here It's, look, we've been notified by a third party, by our third party plan, that an unauthorized activity occurred in our retirement plan, the so-called 401k plan. DeLaval and the plan administrator are cooperating and assisting appropriate law enforcement agencies. We can tell you that no plan or participant assets have been negatively affected in this matter as we are engaged in a continuing investigation. It's not appropriate to discuss it further at this time. This is what we prepared for a third party like the press if they had called to ask. But that wasn't necessary because we never got a call. What was necessary is a whole slew of questions internally by our employees and our retirees. And so we drafted what's called a Q&A. Now, we do Q's and A's for significant litigation as well, because typically you get a lot of questions, and what a Q&A is simply that, questions and answers that you would expect to come. This would prepare me as a spokesperson and kind of our lead executives if they got calls where they got questioned by employees in their departments. This gives them a tool to help answer typical questions. And if they couldn't answer a question, they'd refer it to me. But we tried to evaluate, well, what sort of questions could we anticipate? And I just wanted to point out the notice that I put on here is that this is what we always put on our internal Q&As. It's not designed to be handed to the press or anyone outside the company. It's really an internal document designed to help us communicate with our employees. So, what were some of the questions? These would be questions that we would think would be typically asked. What happened? Why did it take so long before we were notified? Remember, we learned about it on the 28th. The legal department didn't hear about it until December 5. And it was only at that point that we said, hey, we got to tell our employees about this. So our whole goal here was just transparency. Try to be as honest as possible. So we basically told our employees exactly that. The breach occurred on the 28th. We were investigating it. We thought it might have been a larger breach outside our company. Once we discovered it was a breach of DeLaval systems, legal department was notified, and we notified you as soon as possible. How many accounts were actually hacked? How many were manipulated? How many, have I lost any money? Has anybody else lost any money? If anyone lost any money, will I get it back? If you're wrong and I lost money, will I recover it? What sort of manipulation actually occurred? The next one, number 7, was a big one. What was taken? Was any information of my dependents, my children, my beneficiaries taken? Fortunately, that information in this particular plan was segregated. So all beneficiary information, family information, dependents was not what was hacked. So we were pretty confident that information was not taken. It was all the employee and the retirees' information. What did we do about this breach? Do we know who the hacker is? What should I do as an employee who's now been breached? How are you going to prevent this from happening again? So we had answers written out for all of these, so we could refer to it and answer them as best as we can if we were asked that question.
Yeah, and I guess with number 7, it's good that the beneficiary's info was not compromised and it was segregated, because I'm thinking what I would want to do, let's say for a child, is do a credit freeze or a credit lock for that child through one of the
Credit monitors.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So getting to that, the next step that we took was contracting with credit monitoring services. This is just, you don't have to read this, it just shows you the detail that many of the states require you to give about your credit monitoring services. And that's in the template letter. But bottom line is, we had to pay for at least a year of credit monitoring services for all 1,500 employees and retirees, and get them identity theft insurance and the credit monitoring policy. And just one side note is that we did have this disclaimer that, look, identity theft insurance is underwritten by this insurance carrier, not by us. And while I'm describing what you're getting in the letter, you really have to refer to the policy for, that's where the contract language is, and that's what you're actually getting. So if there's any dispute between what I'm saying and the policy is going to take control.
That's so important because you don't want your letter to create a contractual
Right.
obligation.
Exactly. So you're always thinking about these things as well. And then even with the credit monitoring services, some states required little things to be different, and California required a separate letter because it had a few different little things in it, and California wasn't the only one. There were other states that required little nuances. And then I think out of the 35 states back when this occurred, I think there were about 8 that required notices to the state's attorneys general. My guess is today it's probably almost all the states, but I'm not sure about that. But I would guess more than, this was 8 out of 35. I would bet more states now require it.
Or sometimes there will be a threshold if it's more than 500 people within
In
the
that
state,
state,
then
right.
maybe
And that was the case here too, by the way. So some states we may have had 2 employees didn't raise to a threshold. Other states might have had, if you have 25 or more or something like that.
And so I gave my students an assignment where they looked at Baker Hostetler's website. They maintain a 50-state summary. You could click on the state and get a summary of the statutory requirements.
So that gives them a leg up, frankly, as a general counsel when you are looking at costs. When you know a firm like that, for example, has the data already at their fingertips, and you're not going to be reinventing the wheel, spending money to have that created. Trust me, that goes into your analysis on who to hire.
Right.
And so one of the things you do want to have is know who you're going to go to in that situation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that firm. There are other firms that have the same capabilities, but you want to know that in advance because you don't want to spend 2 of your 5 days, immediately following a cyber breach doing due diligence on the law firm. So the letters to the attorneys general required, basic information, description of the event, the total number of plan participants within the state that were affected, and what actions you've taken. And some of them required follow-up activity. That is, if any further information or further developments, you're obligated to let them know. So the last step was really follow-up as required. Everything we did, every step we took, we documented. Every call we received, we documented. We did that because, first of all, we wanted to learn from this episode and make sure we improved our processes the next time. But also, we wanted to prove our due diligence in responding to this in the event any claims came from any employees, retirees, or even the states. Bear in mind, in many of these states, we were behind the 8 ball right from the get-go because we were past deadlines for informing them. But as Tony and I discussed, when you're forthright with a state and an agency, and they see that you're trying to do the right thing, and they understand what caused the delay, they tend to be willing to let certain things slide as long as you're anxiously living up to your obligations at that point. So we had a lot of return letters, 1,500 employees and retirees. The retirees in particular, we often had old addresses. Sometimes old addresses were in the 401k plan database that they hadn't updated. So we had to try to track down these people, and that wasn't always easy. So that continued for weeks afterwards. As I said before, we continually monitored our vulnerabilities as we improved our security. And of course, we did share all information, including the forensic report, with law enforcement. And naturally, we improved our data security and improved our training, especially helping employees understand what phishing is and how to avoid it and what to do if you see it.
Yeah, I mean, that's so critical. It's such a big area for attacks. In fact, within the last 2 days, I received an email purportedly from the president of DePaul.
Exactly.
Can you get in touch with me right away? And I looked at it and I thought, I don't think I'm that important for him to be reaching out to me. I mean, I'm kind of joking, but but I think the employee training is so critical.
Yeah, we have constantly emails purportedly from the CEO in Sweden. DeLaval is a Swedish company that include a link and say, this is very important. I want you to take a high priority to this. Please click through on this link and give me your response. And that's clearly phishing. Sometimes they get the spelling of his Swedish name, which is Rogestern, incorrectly. But even when they get that correct, it's clearly not typical, as in never does the CEO send out emails like that. But it's tricky, and people have to be aware of it. A lot of companies will do training. Well, they'll send out fake phishing emails, and if you click on it, you get busted, if you will, and the IT department says, no, you did the wrong thing, and now you're going to go through training. And if you did the right thing by forwarding it to the IT department, they'll say, oh, you did the right thing. This was just a training episode, but you did it correctly. But it's important because one little click.
Yeah, it could have saved you from this whole experience, I suppose. Yeah.
And when you look back on this one, no money was lost and there were no lawsuits generated. But we got lucky. We had an employee, one of the 5, whose accounts were manipulated on the 26th and 27th of a month. One of the 5 out of 1,500 happened to call into the 401k plan on the 28th and get blocked because her name and email addresses were changed. What if she hadn't done that? What if one of the 1,495 that weren't manipulated called in and it wasn't someone whose account was manipulated? What if it took 3 weeks before someone whose account was manipulated called in? We might have had all sorts of money drained from that 401k plan.
Yeah, especially if it was taking place during Christmas and around
Thanksgiving,
New Year's.
right?
Oof.
Could have been bad for us, and so you had a little bit of luck, and then a lot of hard work in a concentrated time period to respond to these things, and that has not changed. That's still going to be the case if that happens today.
Well, Noel, I want to thank you so much. I'm sure this will be a huge help to our students. I found it helpful for myself to understand all these practical steps for responding to data breach, so thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone.